My name is David Gushee. I'm going to follow Luke's prompt and just say a little bit about myself and my interest in this event. I teach Christian ethics at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. I also have an appointment at the International Baptist Theological Study Center in Amsterdam and the Free University of Amsterdam. But I would say in the last 10 years, a primary interest of mine has been trying to help resource a community that is growing in the U.S. and around the world that I like to call post-evangelicals, and I'm not the only one who calls them that. These are not the hostile ex-evangelicals that Jonathan spoke about in his talk. These are believing Christians who, for one reason or another, have found themselves either exiled from or needing to leave the U.S. And some other evangelical communities. And there are millions of them, and some of them are finding their way forward, either creating new ecclesial communities or revamping the ones that they're already in. So my sense of my pastoral scholarly role in the last decade has been to try to help resource post-evangelicals. In that work, 5 years ago, I made the suggestion that Christian humanism might be a theological resource moving ahead. It was just a suggestion, and I've been kind of exploring whether there was something there. And so I am here in part to see whether there is something there, whether Christian humanism can be a resource for post-evangelicals that gives life and sustenance. And I personally have found this a very enriching conference. I think there is definitely a resource there, and I look forward to reflecting on it some more. And so today, you faithful folks who have made it to the end, you have a treat. Anthony Reddie is going to speak in our last session. I'm going to close it at 5:40 instead of 5:45 so that it's possible to get to Evensong. Anthony Reddie is a distinguished theologian, and we are really pleased to hear from him. So, Anthony, you are up.
Okay, well, first let me get my non-apology apology in first, which is that is a very nice title, and I thought it up months ago, but I will not be speaking to it. And that's because since I proposed the title, I have co-edited a book called Towards a Critical White Theology, and I've written about 2 or 3 essays in edited books. I'm just tired of talking about whiteness. So I'm not talking about whiteness at all. So, like I said, it's a nice title, but I ain't talking about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about another section from the book that has literally just come out called Living Black Theology. And it's based on a series of workshops I've done over the past 3 years, mainly with the URC, the United Reformed Church in the UK, but also with the Church of England, with both clergy and lay people. And the presenting issue that I will share with you today, which is the ongoing dialectic that draws from the work of Gilroy and very much taps into some of the things that Jonathan has just spoken of in the previous session, is this tension around how do we navigate those tensions between sameness and difference? When is it right that we see beyond our differences, because and there are a whole set of theological perspectives and ideas that many of you know that we have to draw on from the Bible and from Christian tradition that encourage us to transcend our differences however we want to construe them. But when is it important that we recognize those differences because they are something of our humanity? That all of us are human, but all of us are some particular type of human. And so what does it mean, therefore, to hold in tension notions of sameness and difference, and recognizing that in some ways there is an ongoing dialectic that we simply can't solve because the Christian faith has these competing perspectives around both sameness and difference. Paul himself, at one part, in some of his writing, seems to encourage us to transcend that, and then yet in other places he wants us to recognize our particularity. And so what I have done over those past 3 years, and then written it up, obviously in the context of the book, is to navigate that conversation. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that rather than trying to solve the dialectic, it's more about how do we at least navigate those tensions and recognize them. And recognize that when we push to notions of sameness, to that sense of identity in Christ that transcends our lived experience, transcends our social location, that when we're doing that, we are also acknowledging some of the fault lines that come with it, and vice versa on the other side. And so what I did as a way of trying to work this through, I often describe myself as a participative theologian, which is a kind of somewhere between practical theology and black theology. I am indeed a great fan of James Cone, but I am not a systematic theologian. I understand why people do it like that, but I never wanted to write in that way. So instead, what I'm going to do, as is how I've written it in the book, is to tell stories. So I'm a storyteller, so there's no PowerPoint, there's no images, no pictures, nothing clicky, whatever. I'm just going to tell some stories. And the stories are ways of gesturing to some of these bigger theological tensions that we have all lived with, because all of us have lived with these things. Around, in my own experience, I know there have been times when all I have wanted is simply to be a human being and people just to see me like everybody else. And yet there are other occasions when I wanted people to see my particularity because it says something of me, not in an absolutely reductionist way, but because there is something of the culture and the traditions of being Caribbean, particularly being Jamaican, that's my parents, but also being West Yorkshire. Actually, I come from God's own city of Bradford. Met a couple of colleagues from Leeds, okay, you know, but, you know. And to acknowledge that those things are not static. So in many respects, I've become more Yorkshire because I've lived away from it for 42 years. When I was growing up in Yorkshire, I never once said I was Yorkshire. Actually, I came from Bradford. I came from East Bowling, BD4. That's where I specifically came from. But having been in Birmingham for 42 years, I have since developed a more kind of pan-Yorkshire diasporan identity. I'm one of those professional Yorkshire men who loves it so much that's why I don't live there. I like Michael Parkinson and various other kind of sort of professional Yorkshiremen who spend most of their lives elsewhere. But then, in a curious way, talk about Yorkshire, or in my case, talk about Bradford, in a very fixed sense. So the Bradford I talk about does not exist. It stopped existing a long time ago, and yet I still think I belong to it, even though I know it's a fiction. It's a mythology, and so we also then have to factor that into how we think about difference. So in the exercise, when I have performed this with groups, we've got them to do it spatially, but we're not going to do that. We don't have the time to do that. And so what I say to the group is that imagine there is a line, a continuum from 1 to 20. And at number 1 is represented by a sense that when we think about what it means to live together, what we want to emphasize as our point of departure are the things that we have in common, the things that make us the same. If not same, then very similar to one another. We are more alike than unalike. And the Christian faith has very, very clear teachings about that. And so earlier today, when Luke Beverton spoke about that, the doctrine of creation, that sense of all of us being created in the image and likeness of God, period. So there's a sense in which our identity is not in land, or it's not in blood, it's not in geography, as much as I love Yorkshire. And this is not a Yorkshire accent. Actually, it lies in something more ethereal. And yet, it's perhaps one of the most revolutionary things that Paul ever comes up with, is this notion that all the natural things that would define us as human beings are not the most important. It's this relationship to a Palestinian Jew who was crucified and then resurrected on the 3rd day. So number one is the most powerful expression of that. So when we think about how we navigate sameness and difference, how we live together, then a person at number one on the continuum is someone who is just an unabashed individual who says that we have to start from this common inheritance of the things we have in common, this identity, creating the image of likeness of God, part of the body of Christ, certainly if we self-identify as Christian, and the spiritual identity. As you move from 1 up to number 9 in the middle, you're still on this side of the continuum, but the claims of the other side are beginning to weaken the perspective in terms of how we think about sameness. So someone at number 8 or number 9 will still affirm sameness, but not with the same set of convictions as someone at number 1. If you go to the other side of the continuum at number 20, then it's not that the person at 20 has no sense of how significant it is around sameness. It's just that that's not their point of departure. The point of departure will be, well, how then do we recognize our differences? How do we recognize the fact that even as we talk about being human beings, all of us are some particular type of human being? And how the ways in which narrative and the stories we tell significant in how we think about ourselves. I was born, not in Bradford, but I was born in the place where the Independent Labour Party started. So there was a version of the Labour Party before the official Labour Party started. And if you know anything about the left, there's always been this internecine battle that's been going on for well over a century between those who were proper, dyed-in-the-wool real socialists, and then the ones who were more like social democrats, and the ones who, well, said they were Labour, but were never really properly Labour at all. Obviously, I could not possibly name names, but Starmer. Well, all that to say that I'm named after Tony Benn. My dad was a trade unionist. He was a member of the General and Municipal Workers Union. And in my family, there was this ongoing tension between my mum, who was a super Christian, so I often describe her as a big hat-wearing, big bag-wearing Baptist woman. And she loved Jesus, well, actually far more than my dad. Actually, on the pantheon of men in her life, it was Jesus first, Sidney Poitier second, and then my dad third. By a distance. And Jesus, in many ways, was all the things that my dad was not, all the things that she would like him to be. So Jesus was very central to her life. Now, my dad, when we were growing up, did not go to church. He was a trade unionist. And his critique of religion, which my mum deplored, was very much around its exploitation of working class people. And so, as I said, I was named after Tony Benn, because the year before I was born in 1964, Tony Benn had renounced his peerage and decided on a matter of conviction that he would remain a so-called commoner in order to stay in the House of Commons. And that so impressed my dad that I was named after him. People at number 20 will think in terms of difference, or maybe another way of talking about particularity. And so all of us, if we're honest, are some particular type of person. And as you move down from 20 down to the middle, you're still on that side of the continuum, but you're not as pronounced in that thought as the person at number 20. So when I've done the exercise, I then invite people to stand in a particular place where instinctively, at that particular moment, given that all of us can change our minds and our identities are not static, they're fluid, so you can say one thing on one day and do something on another day, and it's still you. To quote one of my favourite philosophers and theologians who has been mentioned a few times over the last day, which is Cornel West, who one of his great taught was, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. And I say that to say that when I first started this exercise, people had a way of always trying to huddle in the middle because it seemed that's a safe place to stand in case either side of the continuum was going to be wrong. Well, first thing to say is that both sides of the continuum are not wrong. There are good reasons for standing on either side, but there are also problems with standing on the other side. So if you stand, let's say, at number 2, there are good theological reasons for doing so, but there are serious problems with doing so as well, and therefore the counterbalance, the counter-arguments that come from, let's say, the other side, will balance off those things. So what I then do, which I'll invite you to a moment, I'm going to pick on a few people, so just in readiness, Luke, like you're going to be the first, so, is to think of the number where you would be and why. You cannot choose numbers 9, 10, or 11. So you can choose numbers 1 to 8 or numbers 12 to 20. And as I said, it's generally not a right and wrong. Although one of the things I will say is that oftentimes when I work with groups, their first instinct is to think that, well, maybe numbers 1 to 8 is where we should be. So that's one interpretation. That's kind of where we should be. But maybe 12 to 20 is where we kind of end up being pragmatically because of the nature of maybe our fallenness and the fact that our ideals about transcending our differences are rarely the case. So, just think for a moment in terms of what number you would give yourself and why. Bearing in mind that there are genuinely no wrong answers. Obviously, you know, I mean, I say this to students and they say, yeah, but we don't really buy that, Professor. But, you know, I mean, there really is a right answer, isn't there? And it's like, no, there isn't. Well, of course there is. No, there is not. So, Luke, 1 to 8, 12 to 20, what number would you give yourself and why?
19.
19, because?
I think we are come to our sameness through our differences, and so we are persons in and through relation. So actually you have to begin with, you have to begin from a point of difference to get to sameness. If you begin with a point of sameness, you end up with a friend-enemy distinction. And so you have to own your particularity, and that is the beginning point and the gift then of your relationality. Without difference, there's no relationship, and without relationship, there's no unity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me think. Okay, so Jonathan.
I was just going to say, Luke, that has got to be wrong. I was just going to say, that's got to be wrong. We begin with sameness. We speak languages together. We come into the world in common, right? I mean, we see, and difference emerges from sameness. You can't even see difference unless you share enough to identify the important differences that name us. No.
So what number would you give yourself? Okay,
I guess the opposite number.
Yeah, what number? I'm going to pin you down for a number. What number?
Well, I'm also thinking about something else you're saying, Anthony, about where you are and where you want to be.
Yeah.
So I think I'm where I am, but maybe I want to be where Luke is. But just intuitively, it strikes me as wrong. But no, I'm sorry. It intuitively strikes me as wrong and right. I'm literally saying nothing. This is what academic people do.
And your number still?
3.
Number 3. Okay, Professor Paul Gilroy.
I don't know the answer, and I'm troubled by the exercise. It seems to me that there are some points in my life where I would have said 3 or 2, and others where I would have said 19.
Yeah.
And I can't just pick one or the other, except unless I say now.
Now.
And now,
right now,
I think I'm more of a 3 than a 19.
Okay, right. Okay, number 3. Okay, so we'll leave it there for now. So just.
This is so uncomfortable.
Oh, I know.
I'm loving it.
I know. Okay, I tell you, let's do one more. So Josh. Obviously, I'm picking all the people I know, so, you know, so obviously. Just what number and why?
Could you just explain the scale one more time?
Okay, so numbers 1 to 8, numbers 12 to 20. 1 is kind of affirming kind of sameness, 12 to 20 affirming difference.
I'll go for 1.
One. Fine. Fine. Thank you. And one of the things I address in the workshop is that discomfort. So when we do it for real, like we get people to stand in the line, and there is that embodied sense of seeing, and every time I've done it, like there's always been a broad cross-section of groups. And I get the group to look at each other and to note where people are standing and to listen carefully to the reasons people give. And the thing I find fascinating, and I've done this about 30-odd times now, is that you never get tired of hearing the ways in which people narrate that sense of where they are. And there was that discomfort. So some people will say, I really don't like the exercise. And it's like, yeah, I know, tough. I'm going to push you. And they'll say, okay, so... And part of making people stand is that someone said, oh, yeah, but, I'm kind of a 3 and a 15. Well, obviously, you can do that figuratively, but you can't stand in 2 places. So it's kind of making you do that. Now, I know there's artificiality to it, because all of us are many things. And so I say to the group, this is not static. It's where you are at this moment in time. And the fact is that even doing the exercise itself and knowing that we're actually narrating these conversations probably influences how you do it. So if you were doing it on another day without that self-consciousness, so all the groups know that they're engaging in an experiment, or at least an exercise, for the purposes of helping me to work through a whole set of ideas. Rather than just theorizing them in the abstract, I really want to draw on people's stories and their embodied identities as ways of helping me to think this through, because of the ways in which, if I had £1 for every time I've sat in a church meeting, I'm a Methodist. And we have wrestled with those 2 competing things. There are those for whom we have to recognize our particularity, because that sense of not being seen is often down to our failure to recognize particular types of difference and their significance on particular moments. And yet, as we have heard in a whole number of ways, most clearly and perhaps most articulately by Professor Gilroy last night, it's the danger then of ossifying that and giving it far more credence than it actually deserves to be when we're thinking about notions of difference. And yet there have been other occasions when, at our sense of wanting to talk about being the same, which is aspirational and hugely important, and there is something about that that is deeply countercultural. So again, just to draw on some of the things that have been said already, one of the things I talk about is the power of conversion. And conversion into something that gives you a new identity that transcends the limitations of one's social location and all the bounded things that go with it. So I remember giving my life to Christ when I was 14 years old at a rally in the Central Methodist Church in Bradford. And for the next 5-6 weeks, there was this sense of euphoria, because I genuinely believed that all of the limitations that came with being a black working class boy in East Bowling, that those things had just all disappeared. That I was this citizen of heaven. I was in the Lamb's Book of Life. And that was just such a powerful thing that it changed my disposition, even to the point where the teacher said, Anthony, are you all right? And I said, I know, I was 14. I said, how you mean, Miss? And she says, well, there's something very different about you. Because there was something about that conversion moment that said to me that whatever the limitations were that had placed on me, these were now gone completely. Now, that said, a few years later, I realized actually it was a bit more complicated than that, because I was changed, and yet I was still in the same body and still subject to some of the same privations of growing up in East Bowling, Bradford. So these things are never settled. And all of you kind of know this. So often when I've worked with groups, particularly those initially, so we usually go from the 1 to 8 side, and people give all their different reasons for that. The theology, and there are whole sets of theology, so like we're not going to go through all of them right now. But I do particularly want to talk about this sense of this doctrine of creation, this sense of being created in the image and likeness of God. And the power of that, certainly when I think about my Caribbean heritage, and the ways in which that has had a profound impact on me when I think particularly of my mother. And everything about her, both in the best of sense, so she had this profound belief that spiritual growth would always have social and cultural consequences. And so growing up in East Bowling, Bradford, we were the only black family in our street. And we were the only church-going family in our street. And so one of the clear markers was always on a Sunday morning, we got up and put on our Sunday best, and we walked the 3 miles to church. And the rest of the street would look on us with this kind of weird curiosity, because most of them, well, not most of them, all of them were not churchgoers. And they were white working class people. And my mother always said to us that we are here simply as an accident of history, but in a generation we will be gone. And we'll be gone, she says, because all the things that are part and parcel of you being a Christian are the things that will get you away from here. And so the truth is that there was no working class pride in my mum. She wanted to be out of East Bowling. And for the most part, nearly all of us made it, except like for my younger brother, who's a renegade. That's a whole other conversation about me and Chris, or Chris and myself, because I represent the aspirant respectability politics of the son who's done well, as has my younger brother, and my sister Chris is the one who is resolutely working class and actually did not want to improve because he thought he was perfectly fine as he is, and of course in a sense he is. But much to the disappointment and the chagrin of my parents, because they really wanted to say quite clearly all of us had transcended East Bowling, but Chris still lives in our family home. But the downside of that, in terms of when we think about the theology of holiness and sanctification, we grew up in the Methodist tradition, a High Wesleyan tradition, so this sense of being set apart, this identity of being in Christ, being in the world but not of it, being sojourners, allied us to a whole set of other people who also shared that identity. So when we used to go to the Central Methodist Mission, that was our world in the world. That was where I learned all the social habits that would make me middle class. So, for example, I remember doing scripture exams, as we did every single summer. Now, thinking about the scripture exams, well, they were a pain in the proverbial at the time, but it did mean that by the time I came to do my O-levels and A-levels, I had exam technique down pat. So whereas my friends were all bricking it, thinking, oh my God, these exams, it's like, you know, I mean, I've been doing exams since I was 8 years old. Learning memory verses. So as we know, and I'm not the first to say this, there has always been particularly a relationship between Christian theology, forms of formation discipleship, and their outworking into social and geographical mobility, particularly from non-conformist Christianity, so Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, that whole panoply of Christian identity. What was also incumbent within it was a kind of respectability politics that also meant that we were not permitted to play with the local kids, because like my mum said, well, you know, I'm like, they're not like you. I mean that our identity was not in East Bowling, it was in Jesus Christ, but it was in Jesus Christ allied to the Central Methodist Church that was largely full of middle-class young people. So So I could play out with the friends in church, but I couldn't play out with the local oiks, apparently. I'm still wrestling with that. So one of the things I will get to hopefully towards the end of the talk are the internalization of empire that comes through Christian theology, particularly through the mission Christianity, whereby you internalize things that you spend some time deconstructing, and you know you've deconstructed, and then there are probably other things that I haven't even thought about yet, because they're so deeply etched into my sense of being, because part of our formation, certainly within the Methodist tradition, was to be proud of our working class roots, but on the understanding that you would be middle class. That formation wouldn't mean picking up good habits, so the good habits were that I did not drink alcohol until I was 21 years old, and even then, I lied to my parents, because we grew up in a teetotal household. And so when I went to University of Birmingham, aged 19 years old, and started to drink for the first time, I worked on the basis that what my mother did not know, she did not need to worry about, so I would come back to Bradford and pretend I was teetotal. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. I don't say that with any sense of pride, it's just simply that when you've been imbued in you that the body is your temple, then clearly why then would you pollute it? So I've never smoked. And I've never gambled. Well, tell a lie, I bought a lottery ticket when it first came out and felt so bad that I've never done it again since. Because gambling and smoking and drinking were things of the world that had no virtue to them whatsoever. There was nothing that was ever self-improving. And although my dad did drink and smoke, he was not allowed to do it in the house. So he would go to his working men's club and do it. So there's something very powerful about that sameness side that I know I've imbibed. And so although I personally would probably choose maybe 18, 19 on the continuum, I know that there's a part of me that would also probably want to choose number 2 and number 3, because that sense of being part of something bigger, that sense of being part of a spiritual and theological community of East Bowling was that transcendent power that helped me to see that the world of East Bowling was never going to contain me. Actually, I was going to be able to transcend it because of my faith. And yet the downside of that is, as I said, are the things then that you internalize without even realizing this. So one of the stories I want to tell is in 1990 when my parents went back to the Caribbean. They retired and went back to the village where my mom came from. She had land. My dad's family didn't. And so they went back to where my mom came and went back to the little chapel where she had first worshipped, and she herself had been converted when she was 15. And one of the delights over the number of years between 91 and when my mom died in 2014, my dad is still going strong, he'll be 92 in a couple of weeks' time, was that I would go out, certainly after the year 2000 when I got my doctorate, and so I'd go visit them, and then there was usually this kind of sort of 3-part conceit that we would go through every single time. So first it was, so Dr. Reddie, my mum would always call me, Dr. Reddie, she would say, it's like, Bob, I'm Anthony. You call me, actually, like my dad called me Anthony, but no, Dr. Reddie. Can I prevail upon you to preach in the chapel? And I would say, no, man, I don't want to preach. I've come on holiday. I just want to. He says, yes, but you know, but you have a duty to the people to share all this knowledge. So okay. Now, when I say share the knowledge, every copy of book I'd ever written, I gave her a copy, and she put on this display shelf. Dr. Anthony Reddie, my son, and these are all her books. I mean, she never read a word of it and didn't believe anything I'd ever written, but still, she was very proud. So firstly, will you preach? Yes. Then secondly, and eventually I would say yes always, and she says, that's fine. But do you have to talk about all this black thing, really? I mean, you have to go on this blackness. It's like, Mom, everybody in the church is black. And all of us are descendants of enslaved people. If there's any place I'm going to talk about blackness, it should be here. Well, if you must, she says. That's the second conceit. And then the third conceit always was, because she always called me Dr. Reddie, was at some point someone in the church would come to me with a physical ailment and say, but Doc, can you come in? And it's like, no, I'm not that kind of doctor. And at which point, my mother would intervene and say, no. He's a doctor of learning. And I say, well, learning about what? Well, the Bible. At which point they would then quote me some obscure text and say, so usually something of, so when's the second coming? Well, I don't know that. Okay, so is my deceased husband, who was a drinker and beat me terribly, but is he in heaven? Well, actually, I don't know that either. So at which point, the third conceit would be, at some point, someone would say to my mum, just out of earshot, look, he's a doctor, but he's a pretty useless doctor. Well, obviously, nothing material and practical for the people in the village of Belcastle. But the reason why I set up that particular scenario is that it was usually fairly benign, and for the most part, my parents were always inordinately proud that their son was an academic and had written books. That's the diasporan dream. That's the dream of every migrant parent, that you come to Britain and all the privations of migration into a country that is not your country, where you are treated as an outsider and a second-class citizen, but your children transcend anything that you could ever imagine of yourself. And the Christian faith was very central to that. But on this one occasion, I decided in my over-cleverness that I would play extracts from the Jamaica Patois Bible. If you know anything about the practices of the Bible Society, if there is 1 million people who speak a language, and it has to be a language and not just a dialect or a Creole, but if 1 million people who speak a language, then the Bible Society will translate the Bible into that idiom. And so it had been decided, maybe a generation before, through the University of the West Indies, that Jamaican was a language. It wasn't just a patois, it was a language in the same way that Afrikaans is not just a derivation of Dutch, but it's also a language. So they translated the Bible, but because patois is largely an oral means of communication, most people can't read it and certainly can't write it, they decided that rather than just translate it in the normal way, like they make a series of cassettes and CD-ROMs. And so I played an extract from this, with Jesus speaking in Jamaican patois. One of the gospel stories, it was the story where Luke 8, where the woman touches the hem of Jesus' garment. And so I played this to the congregation, and then I preached on it. And the silence was deathly. Normally when I preached, yeah, I throw in a few jokes and stuff, and people would it would be a very efficacious occasion. Not on this occasion, the silence was palpable. So much so that when we drove home, I knew something was up, because I'm in the back, my parents are in the front, my dad's driving, and it's funereal silence. Eventually slams on the brakes, turns around to me and says, "How could you embarrass me like that, son?" And he's just mad. Because for him to have Jamaican patois, working class language, in a hallowed place of the church, was to desecrate the very nature of what it is to be in God's house with a language that obviously had been demonized by the missionaries and colonial regimes for centuries. Even now, and Jamaican society has changed enormously. I mean, like, there was a time when people like Paul Gilroy with locks would not be allowed in any sensible or government place, because basically that was seen to be actually transgressive. That's changed. But I would say that the one way in which you can still make a class distinction is on how you speak. The middle class people can code switch. So they can go from Jamaican patois and speak the proletariat, and then they can speak perfectly standard received English. Working class people can only speak one way. So the acceptable way to discriminate is to discriminate on the basis of a language that is still seen as being deeply problematic. So me playing this in church was beyond the pale. The irony is that, like, my dad's telling me off in Jamaican patois for having patois in the church, which is what everybody speaks. Well, everyone in the congregation, the preacher can never speak like that. I know from experience that when my dad is in that mood, like, you can't reason with him. So I turned to my mom, who was also much more reasonable, and I said, "Mom, I said, I know that you're the prayer warrior here. So when you pray every morning, which you did from 6 till 7 on her knees, read the Bible first and then prayed for an hour for everybody in her family. And then last thing at night. So when you're praying to Master Jesus, I said, what language are you using when you're praying? I mean, are you praying in the language of the heart, or are you sort of trying to nice it up and pitch it up and sort of try to equate to standard received English? She paused for a second and said, it's none of your business what language I use when I'm talking to God, which I said, well, I take that as vindication that it's Jamaican patois that you're talking about. You just don't want to disagree with Dad. I say all that to say that one of the problems with talking about sameness, it's not that it's wrong in and of itself. Of course it's not. There are very, very good theological arguments around it. But of course, part of the basis of the British Empire was like to make everybody the same. Part of the basis of the empire was to demonize certain forms of difference in order that there was a respectability politics that ensures that the empire, a Christian empire, is an empire of order and of certain class distinctions, and a demonization of those things that might be called indigenous. So the truth is, even though the intellectuals in the University of the West Indies will talk about the importance of the Jamaican language, and certainly in the theological college, like the United Theological College of the West Indies, they will still have those classes that will talk about mother tongue theology and vernacular theology. How do you theologize through the cultures and the languages and the traditions of reggae music and dancehall music that are indices of one's particularity, those numbers from 12 up to 20, when everything about the colonial regimes and the Christianity that overpinned that has spent much of its time actually demonizing it. Even to this day, I cannot convince my dad that Jamaican language is a language. He'll say, no, it's bad, broken talk, and we should outlaw it. Even though if we outlawed it, like, you would not be able to talk to anyone, because that's the only language that you can speak, Dad. So sameness has problems. Very quickly, on to the other side, the difference. In many respects, during this exercise, I have been forced to critique myself as a black liberation theologian, because my natural disposition is to talk about those numbers. Certainly, I would probably give myself maybe 18, 19 on the scale. And certainly, a younger version of me would have been utterly bullish around the assertion of actually talking about difference. But I think what's happened to me, certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, when I have gone back to read the work around the Black Atlantic and work of Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall, and some of the scholars that come out of the School for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Things that were never part of my theological training, by the way, so it was interesting that I studied at Birmingham University, and we were warned off, actually, like, not to go anywhere near this dangerous centre that was doing all this dangerous left-wing stuff. And being young and being naive, it never occurred to me that someone who was named after Tony Benn, that's precisely where I should be going, but no, so I never went there. That the theology and the history department were very clear about where they stood ideologically compared to the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. But what I have, I guess, regained through going back to that tradition has been a more acute critique of the problems when you envelop yourself, particularly within types of identity politics. And I've seen this in two ways. The first way, which is not something that I've spoken of before, but I will speak of it now, I will do it in very vague terms because I don't want to out the people involved. But I remember having a conversation with a good friend, a black woman who works in North America, but she's not African American. And we have a shared identity in this so far as her parents are Caribbean like mine, but she was born in London, but then they decamped to Canada. And she was invited for an interview to be on our search committee for a very prestigious post within a well-known university in America. And she was invited to come, and she did a really good interview, and they were going to offer the job. And then at the last minute, it came to light that the fairly large cohort of African Americans in this college all said, if you appoint this woman, we will all resign. And the administration said, well, sorry, why? You know, she's a black woman. Because, yeah, but she's not the right type of black person. Meaning that she did not belong to a particular configuration of blackness that meant that essentially she was African American. Yes, her parents were from the colonies, and yes, in terms of her ancestry, they were enslaved peoples. But I think one of the challenges one has to wrestle with in terms of a particular configuration of black theology, very much drawing on the work of Jonathan Tran, has been the dangers of having types of identity politics where the boundaries look more like walls and hedges. That kind of boundedness that then actually doesn't lead to extremism by any means, but actually like the logic of a certain type of exceptionalism that is grounded in a particular set of identities will inevitably have problems because you then slip into those places of nationalism. So even if you don't espouse it, and certainly most black theologians in North America are not nationalists in the traditional sense, but it's hard to resist the logic of it if your theological antennae is so grounded in a particular identity that it's almost blocked off and certainly is not open to other people. I shared this with a few people earlier in that I have been in dialogue and I have so many friends who are within the African American community. So this is not an attack on them per se, and certainly some of the people who have inspired me, not just James Conn, but Dwight Hopkins and many others are people I owe an enormous debt to. But it's been interesting being part of the Black Theology group as a non-African American. Because I've been in it, but always on the edge of it. On at least a couple of occasions, there have been search committees that were tentatively see if they could lure me to America. And what killed all those conversations was that when I then said, well, what would I teach? And they said, well, we'd love you to teach practical theology. You could teach contextual theology. Maybe given your family background, like we'd love someone to come and do Caribbean theology. I said, yeah, but I do black theology. Oh, yeah, but like you can't do black theology over here. Because again, like they're the wrong type of blackness. That's a hard conversation to have because so much of what we have done as black theologians is to work with that kind of esprit de corps, with this shared identity. And for very, very good reasons in order to resist the power of whiteness. In the UK, I'm one of only 3 black people who has a lecturing job in a university in Britain. And certainly within the Oxford faculty, I'm one of only 3 people. Although it's worth noting that all 3 of us were college appointees, not faculty ones. So I get the importance of that sense of identity politics that wants to talk about our shared identities and the things we have in common that can empower each other. But also we have to be honest about those gradations and those differentiations that exist within that. So even within the Black Theology in Britain movement, the truth is it's largely a Caribbean movement. Very few people from Africa and the continent have been involved in that conversation. Not because we've ever excluded anyone, just because the optics and the theological models that we have used, including Exodus, it's taken maybe far too long to bring the post-colonial critique into that then reminds us that God of liberation only liberates the Israelites, but actually not the otherites, and certainly not the Canaanites or anyone else. But I would sort of tend to ignore that bit. So part of the ongoing tension for me as a black theologian is to think about how do I allow some of my earlier proclivities around the 1 to 8 side to remind me of the limitations of the identity politics that I've largely imbibed, and maybe until the last 5-10 years has not been as critical of it as I should have been, around the limitations of having an identity. Still rooted in being a disciple of Jesus, but very much rooted within a black post-colonial identity, largely Caribbean, and largely historic church. With the exception of Robert Beckford, for the most part, Pentecostalism hasn't played a huge role within the development of black theology, although having said that, there is now a Centre for Black Theology at Queen's that does have a preponderance of Pentecostal people there, so that is beginning to change. So in summation, what I tried to do in this chapter is to narrate those tensions and to accept that one side is not better than the other, like we need them both. And maybe one of the critical questions then becomes within the various communities I've been a part of is, how do we allow those two sides to be in conversation with each other? Without the presumption, which is possible to do, but it's not always as easy as we imagine, not to assume that your particular positionality is somehow really just a little bit better than someone else's. Especially when we think of some of our issues around kind of identity politics in Britain. And if I'm honest with you, a kind of smug liberalism that exists within some of us. So if you know Birmingham, I live in Moseley Village. I live just outside of Moseley Village, which is the cappuccino drinking, red wine drinking, Guardian reading heart of the West Midlands. You know, so we love everybody, but we know that if everyone was just a bit more like us, the kingdom of heaven would be that much closer. But we do it with a smile on our face and obviously with the love of Jesus, so that makes it okay. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reddie. We have about 13 minutes for dialogue. So who would like to get the conversation going? Okay, I see a hand on the third row or so.
Anthony, thank you so much for such an interesting and humane talk and so much personal background there. Now you alluded to the fact that you have a number of strands of identity as a black man, as a Yorkshireman, which gives perhaps a different image. I recognise strands of identity in my own situation. How do you see, we've talked about the sameness and the difference kind of line, but how do you see intersectionality making a difference on that line? Do you think it skews us one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about... So how I theorise around that sense of intersectionality, just to kind of push the metaphor a little further, is to say that there's not necessarily one line, there's a series of parallel lines. And because that we have multiple selves, that I didn't necessarily do this in the exercise, but certainly when I was kind of writing up and then kind of working through the image I was working with, as imperfect as it is, I realised that one of the things we often do is that there are different selves. All of us have multiple selves. And what part of us becomes significant is dependent entirely on context. I know that being Yorkshire, I feel more Yorkshire because I live in Birmingham. But actually when I go back and visit family in Yorkshire, that Yorkshire thing just kind of dissipates because I'm just, you know, I mean, people still sound like me and I still sound like them. So it's not fixed. Those things are not fixed. And so part of the tension then, I think, as a way of critiquing myself with that particular line, is that when we have those different lines, there is a temptation to prioritize one over the other. So I know that in an early iteration of my work, I would have been highly conscious of being black. Almost to the extent of that somehow then subsumed all the other isms, included obviously things that are very, very slippery, like social class. in my head, I still think of myself as a working class oik who comes from East Bording in Bradford. But of course, that conceit only works so long as I'm not in that place. When I go back to that place, the first thing that happens is that my brother then has to explain to his friends what his older brother does for a living. And at that point, it's really weird in that suddenly I feel really embarrassed like to say I'm a theologian, because when I say I'm a theologian, they go, so what's that then? Well, okay, it's not so much that, it's more like, pardon my friend, so what the fuck is that then? And I'm like, well, and at which point, it sounds ridiculous, but I kind of wish I was a bricklayer. Of course, I don't want to be a bricklayer, but at that point, it would just be easier, especially when they then say, obviously I'm playing this for laughs, but they say, okay, what do you want to drink? And in my head, I would like a glass of Merlot. But of course, that would just seal my demise and say, no. Okay, I'll take a pint of bitter. That takes me all night to drink because it tastes disgusting. I can't stand the stuff. So all that to say that I think one of the things that the existing model of black theology, or to more accurately, I think maybe the North American model of black theology, because I think the British model has always been more eclectic because of the role of empire. That we all have a diverse set of ways of being here. And so there's not one set of authenticated notion of what is the correct version. There are lots of multiple versions of being here, which is actually one of the things that makes our version of black theology quite rich, because there's no priority amongst a particular group. And so what I think I have to remind myself and the students I teach is keeping all those intersectional things open, and also being attentive to the things that you don't talk about because it's so normative. So as a heterosexual male, I've never seen that as being part of my identity, and yet actually that gives me huge amounts of privilege, perhaps even more so than some of the other things, because of the nature of homophobia that exists within some black communities, not all black communities, but certainly some black communities. And so I know that even though I'm single, age 60, and therefore people kind of think, okay, so when you say you're single, Anthony, and I say, well, I'm not going to answer that question because obviously there's an implied question behind it. There's a sense in which that most of my friends know I'm not gay. So even though I don't answer it, there is still a certain privileging of that part of our identity that I don't really talk about. But it makes a huge difference. And if I suddenly say, well, actually, I really am gay and always have been, that would be a whole set of other conversations that would be deeply uncomfortable, even in 2025. So, yeah.
Somebody else. Second row here. Yep. Denise.
So in deference to your mom, whose idol was Sidney Poitier, if you could comment a little on the decolonization of black theology as expressed in the movie Sinners, and the parent who did not want the son expressing his music, and the white Ku Klux Klan who wanted to grab and steal and suck his art form. And the play Retrograde, which is still showing here in London, and as seen through British eyes, for Sidney Poitier, who was being asked to give up his connection with his community and his art in order to cut into the film industry in the US. But in both cases, the theological implications of how they were brought up and being asked to give it up, or it's going to be taken from you in one way or the other, and the decolonization of the thinking that brought that.
Okay, well, firstly, I've not seen Sinners. I really don't do horror that well, so, either vampires and stuff, I'm sorry. But,
decolonization again.
Yeah, I know.
It's characterized as a
movie, vampires,
it's 10 minutes of a 2-hour exercise.
That's true, but you underestimate the nature of my cowardice. So, yeah. I'm just saying, I mean, I do many things, but bravery, well, physical bravery is not one of them. So, but I take your point. It is something I probably should look at. I think one of the interesting things about the inheritance of Caribbean Christianity, and it's worth reminding us, I say reminding us because most people probably don't know this, that the first book that had the nomenclature of decolonizing in is actually a Caribbean writer, that's Noel Erskine. So in 1983, he does a book for Orbis called Decolonizing Theology. And what he does, he looks at the history of Jamaica. And one of the things he does as a way of decolonizing that project is to remind us of the ways in which mission Christianity was never a respecter of indigenous, or should I say, African-derived religions. And so one of the things he does is to begin to recover the fact that a type of, I guess, a hybrid identity that's always been deeply colonial is that we've never been purely anything, that there's always been those other dimensions. So even my mom was a very, very strict Christian, and yet there are still things that she did that are part of African retention that she would do habitually, and if you ever point them out, like, she get embarrassed and change the subject, but still do them. So, for example, as I'm sitting here, I can tell you that back on my bed in my bedroom, I have the Bible open at the Psalms in order to run duppy. That's ghosts, malignant ghosts. Now, Protestant Christianity has no truck with that. But of course, the thing is about every set of diasporan people, wherever they are, there's always been these forms of adaptations that official Christianity has never been able to configure, because those notions of not just purity, but also some sense of fidelity. So if you're a Christian, like, you're only for Jesus Christ, as if somehow Jesus is purely Eurocentric and Greek. So hence a brilliant book, again, much overlooked, by Robert E. Hood. In 1994, he wrote a book called Must God Remain Greek? And by Greek, actually what he really means is white European. And so part of that decolonizing work is to recognize that syncretism is not this horrible category that was, in truthfulness, invented by Europeans like to demonize people of African and Asian and subalterns, because actually Christianity has always been syncretistic. All of us have always known that, but of course the point is that only some people can do it. And other people are not allowed to do it, because somehow that is somehow sort of besmirching Jesus Christ. Well, actually, like, we are never pure anything. And we know that the logics of purity and fidelity are always part and parcel of what empire does. And again, that's part of the critique that one might make from the 1 to 8 side. That doesn't make sameness wrong. It just means that we always have to be careful of what historical moment we're configuring that conversation and its impact upon particular groups of people. But I will put on my brave pants and I will go watch that film. But if I have nightmares, as I have watching Jordan Peele and some of the other stuff, I'm going to come and blame you. Trust me, I'm going to come and blame you, because I've been persuaded to watch Jordan Peele films and not slept a wink afterwards.
Well, I think we had probably better stop there, but I would like to, I'm sure, speak for all of us in thanking you for your transparency, your vulnerability, your modeling of how to do theology. So thank you very much.